Welcome back. This is my second episode. Please forgive the sound quality of the first one. Still trying to get that worked out. In my last episode, which was the first in an ongoing series for Pride Month, I suggested that much of the Pride Revolution's success was due to mass social and psychological manipulation, rather than sound philosophical argument. To be clear, I did not prove that claim. That will be the goal of my later episodes. Proponents of Pride did provide arguments in defense of their lifestyle. On a popular level, they use the following: the consent argument, the no-harm argument, the civil rights argument, the human rights argument, and the born this way argument. On a more academic level, they appeal to Kantianism, utilitarianism, legal positivism, existentialism, and Rawlsianism. But these more technical arguments were not used to win over the culture. They were far too abstract and complicated for the average person to understand, let alone accept. For the record, I don't think these more sophisticated theories are sound either, but that's not my point. My point is that it was the popular level arguments that I just noted that were designed for public consumption. My claim is that none of those are even remotely sound. They're so weak, in fact, that one is forced to find alternate explanations for how the movement succeeded. As I explained, some earlier proponents of Pride openly admitted that they were trying to transform the culture by mass psychological techniques. I could have gone on with other examples, but there was one that I failed to mention, one which is so important that I just have to squeeze it into this podcast before I turn to a different issue. One of the single greatest causes of the Pride Revolution was the targeting of public school children by the government. Consider President Clinton's proclamation 7203, otherwise known as his official declaration of Gay and Lesbian Pride Month. The title is misleading. It was not merely the inauguration of Pride Month. It was part of a concerted effort at that time to bring Pride ideology into the public school system. This proclamation, issued in June of 1999, directed government educators to train children in the values of Pride. After rehearsing his legislative acts on behalf of Pride, Clinton goes on to say this, quote, "But we cannot achieve true tolerance merely through legislation. We must change hearts and minds as well. Our greatest hope for a just society is to teach our children to respect one another, to appreciate our differences, and to recognize the fundamental values that we hold in common." As part of our efforts to achieve this goal, earlier this spring, I announced that the Departments of Justice and Education will work in partnership with educational and other private sector organizations to reach out to students and to teach them that our diversity is a gift. Now, it's easy to underinterpret the significance of these words. Clinton is not simply saying that we should teach children to not bully one another. He's not simply saying that we should teach kids to show kindness and respect to others. We don't need a presidential proclamation for that. We don't need the Departments of Justice and Education for that. Those lessons in basic civility were already being taught in public schools. When Clinton and the progressives behind this proclamation referred to changing hearts and minds of children, they were talking about reconditioning the moral judgments of these children about the status of homosexual behavior itself. That is what this proclamation is all about, along with all the subsequent tax-funded training programs and curricula that followed. At a bare minimum, this meant teaching children that there's nothing morally wrong with homosexual behavior. This is what discrimination means for many secular progressives. In order for little Johnny to be accused of discrimination against his gay classmates, it is not necessary for him to punch a gay friend in the face or to call him all sorts of derogatory names. It's sufficient that little Johnny simply tell his friend that homosexuality is a sin or that it's morally wrong in some way. This alone is now considered by Pride proponents to be unacceptable. Some go so far as to call that disrespectful, dehumanizing, emotionally harmful, psychologically damaging, and so on. Now, if the government is requiring teachers to discourage our children from forming negative moral judgments about homosexuality, how is that not indoctrination? And yet it goes farther. The children are not simply told not to pass negative moral judgment on the homosexuals next to them. They were being told to affirm the validity of that lifestyle. It's one thing to censor children, it's another thing to emotionally coerce them into espousing the party line. When they're being taught to see sexual diversity as a gift, as something that virtuous people are grateful for and want to celebrate, well, of course children will wind up doing that. And this, it seems to me, is a whole new level of indoctrination. A very, very effective one, and it played a massive role in tilting the nation towards pride. It also went a long way to explaining the millennials and Gen Z into their generation's distinctively new stance on pride. Think about this. Suppose little Johnny is born in 1994. He enters the government educational system in the year 2000 as a 6-year-old. After 12 years of exposure to pride ideology, he graduates in 2012 sharing its core values. Now consider that there were tens of millions of little Johnnies and little Sallys all across the United States who underwent this same indoctrination at the same time. Is it any coincidence that by 2015, when Obergefell happened, that the overwhelming supporters of pride were the younger generation? Just consider the following stats. According to Gallup polls, in 1988, 68% of Americans opposed same-sex marriage. This remained pretty steady up until 1996 or so. During Clinton's second term in office, though, the numbers began to drop. By 2004, they dropped down to 55%. By 2009, to 49%. By 2015, to 37%. By 2018, it dropped to 32%. By 2021, it dropped to 29%. And then by 23, to 22%. I'm not arguing that this shockingly fast shift in public opinion was due solely to educational propaganda, but if you think this is mere correlation without causation, I'm not sure what else to say. All right, I now want to turn to the promised topic of this podcast about the future fate of pride. Here there are really 3 questions. First, will pride be overturned? Second, can it be overturned? Third, should it be overturned? If it can't be overturned, then obviously it won't be. But if it can be, then maybe it will be. We could then take up the related questions of how that might transpire, or the likelihood of it happening. I have heard some people say that it cannot in fact be done, no more than we can return to a world without cars or phones. But is this really true? Technological revolutions are different from philosophical, moral, and legal revolutions. I grant that barring a nuclear war, it seems impossible for us to go back to a pre-digital age or a pre-industrial age. Our lives are too deeply dependent on that tech. Practically speaking, it is now a social necessity for us to use cars and phones. It's not an absolute necessity since we could go live in the woods like hermits, but given the structure of modern society, it's now impossible for the society as a whole to function without cars and phones. So I agree, we cannot go back even if we wanted to. But can the same thing be said about pride culture as it currently exists in the United States? Is it impossible to go back to a pre-pride culture? Is there some sort of social necessity for us to surrender ourselves to it? I'd say no. Unlike digital technology, pride culture is not necessary to our lives or to the well-being of the nation. Now please note what I did not just say there. I did not say that people who happen to be gay, for example, are not necessary to our national well-being. That's obviously false. I said pride culture is not necessary, and that's a critical distinction. It's often argued that homosexuals and trans people are indispensable members of society. Think about the number of doctors and scientists and teachers and police and paramedics who are members of the LGBTQ community. But what exactly does this mean? When Bill Clinton first announced Pride Month in 1999, he argued that such people should be celebrated for their contributions to the country. He said this, and I quote, "I encourage all Americans to observe this month with appropriate programs, ceremonies, and activities that celebrate our diversity, and to remember throughout the year the gay and lesbian Americans whose many and varied contributions have enriched our national life." End quote. Clinton's claim that the contributions of gays and lesbians have enriched our lives is called in logic an ambiguous statement. It can mean one of 2 different things. Let me illustrate with an example of a paramedic. All agree that a paramedic makes a vital contribution to society. So suppose Joe is gay and that Joe is a paramedic. President Clinton's claim could mean then either of the following 2 claims. 1, that Joe's behavior as a paramedic enriches our lives, or 2, that Joe's behavior as a homosexual enriches our lives. Clearly, these are 2 radically different claims. I know exactly what it would mean to say that Joe as a paramedic is enriching our lives, but what would it mean to say that Joe as a homosexual is enriching our lives? The question is not whether a paramedic who just happens to be gay is making positive impacts as a paramedic. Of course he is, and we should celebrate his contributions to society. But why? Because he's gay? No, because he's a paramedic. The logical question then is why Joe's contributions as a paramedic require me or anyone else to celebrate his homoerotic behavior in the bedroom. It should be patently obvious that there is no good reason for that. There just is no connection between the 2. If you're still not convinced, then consider the following. Recall Clinton's argument. We are to celebrate, quote, the gay and lesbian Americans, end quote, on the grounds that their, quote, varied contributions have enriched our national life, end quote. Now suppose one were to swap out the words gays and lesbians with the words polygamists, alcoholics, Klansmen, or minor attracted persons. You will think that's absurd, of course. But why? Is it because you don't think these people ever make any valuable contributions to society? Of course not. You know full well that there are racists and pedophiles who have made many valuable contributions to society, just like there are many gays and lesbians who have made valuable contributions to society. But you would object to celebrating racists and pedophiles on those grounds. That is, on the grounds that they made valuable contributions in other contexts of their lives, when they are not doing the sort of things that racists and pedophiles do. You would argue quite rightly that the fact that they've done some good things in their lives doesn't mean we should celebrate their racist or pedophilic behaviors. So why is it then that we're supposed to celebrate the homoerotic behaviors of people who happen to do some good things here and there outside of their bedrooms? At this point, you're probably thinking there's got to be some sort of difference between these 2 cases. But in terms of the argument, there really is no difference. Perhaps the reason you think there's a difference is because you believe that homosexuality is okay. If instead you believe that homosexuality is wrong, you would find Clinton's argument utterly absurd. You would think it is just as absurd as to call us to celebrate polygamists, alcoholics, racists, and pedophiles, simply because they've done some good things in other areas of their lives. But now consider this additional problem. If you already believe that homosexuality is okay, then Clinton's argument becomes pointless. For again, his argument makes sense only if we already believe that homosexuality is not a problem. But if we already believe that, then there's no need to argue for it. That is to say, no need to argue for homosexuality on the grounds that homosexuals make good contributions. If I already know that homosexuality is okay, it's no longer necessary to point out that they make good contributions as, say, paramedics and doctors and teachers and whatnot. Those additional facts just aren't the thing that makes their sexual behavior acceptable. So you see, Clinton's entire argument commits the fallacy of equivocation. He's shifting meanings in the middle of his argument. His premise is about gays and lesbians only insofar as we consider them as useful members of society. But its conclusion is about gays and lesbians as gays and lesbians, that is to say, as people who engage in homoerotic sex. His argument therefore uses what we can call logical sleight of hand. To summarize, there's a big difference between the claim that society needs paramedics who happen to be gay and the claim that society needs gays who happen to be paramedics. With that point established, my question then is this. By what possible logic could the welfare of a nation depend upon the existence of gays, or upon trans women as trans women? As paramedics, doctors, inventors, educators, police, sure, fine. But as gays? As trans? I just don't see that. There's just no social necessity for pride. No social necessity for homosexual or transsexual behavior. And since that is the case, the analogy with the technological revolution just breaks down. The second reason for believing that there is no necessity for the pride culture to remain is that we know from history that cultural revolutions can be undone by counter-revolutions. It's just a historic fact that huge cultural changes have been undone. Just think about the history of communism in Europe. The Pride movement, as we know it, is a cultural artifact. It did not exist until very recently, so of course it can be overturned. In my next episode, I will discuss two massive threats to the future of Pride in the secular West. The first is the infiltration of Islam into the West. The second is the revival of traditional Christianity. For all their differences, the cross and the crescent have at least one thing in common. They symbolize something radically different from the rainbow. I'll explain why in episode 3.